if I'm carrier A, I want to work with carrier B on this trade and carrier C on that trade and carrier D on a third trade. This is the freedom I get without being in an alliance, but rather to be in vessel cooperations or vessel sharing agreements, or whatever we tend to call them.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Freight to the Point. I'm Richard Fatal, the host of today's episode, and today I'm joined by Niels Madsen, Vice President of Product and Operations at Sea Intelligence. Today we're delving into the topic of schedule reliability, which has been a key talking point in the industry in recent times. Shippers have faced significant challenges in maintaining reliable schedules, leading to disruption in operational planning and execution. Whilst the situation has improved since the onset of COVID-19, many are left wondering whether schedule reliability will return to pre-pandemic levels. So who better to discuss this topic with me than Niels? Welcome, Niels. Do you want to give the audience a quick intro of yourself?
My name is Niels Madsen. I am with the Sea Intelligence. I've been with Sea Intelligence for the last two and a half years. Before that, I have about 30 years behind me in Maersk and MSC, doing mainly operation, but also inland operation, inland setup, doing terminals and terminal operation. So quite a wide variety within the terminal and the operations area.
So, Niels, when we talk to customers and we try to help them define their carrier strategy, their contracting strategy and the way in which they think about the regularity of their shipments, from the Far East into Europe, from the Far East into, the US in particular, we often talk to some of the reliability data that Sea Intelligence publish. We look at historical variations in schedule reliability. Can you, give us a sense of the way in which you define reliability, how you compare carriers and how you measure their schedule reliability?
So basically what happens is that the carriers are providing us with the schedule data every week. And what we do is we compare that week actual data to the schedule that they have previously given us. So you can argue that what they are changing their schedules every week. So wouldn't they always be on time then? But what we do is that 2 weeks before the estimated time of arrival, we put a lock on the schedules that they're providing to us. And then the following 2 weeks, they will continue to upload their actual data. And now we will compare it. Once the vessel has arrived, we will compare it to the schedule that they provided us 2 weeks earlier. So we have this lockdown period of 2 weeks where we have the schedule from 2 weeks earlier and the actual arrival that then happened on the day. When that happens, we look at the actual arrival. Is it plus minus 1 day, and that's 24 hours basically, 1 day to the scheduled arrival that we were provided 2 weeks earlier. If it's late, 1 day late, it's off schedule. And if it's 1 day early, it will actually be counted as on schedule. So that's sort of how it's measured.
So really it gives shippers an indication of the extent to which they can rely on that carrier, on that lane, because I've seen that the data you provide is very helpful. It's at a lane level as to whether or not that carrier can be relied on for the purposes of, I guess, operational planning purposes. When you think about putting data into your ERP system, thinking about how much you can plan and what the lead time you can calculate and how much stock you need to order, it's really to what extent you can rely on the carrier. I guess one of the challenges there is that 1 day late may not be such a problem for some shippers. They might have more of a problem with 5 days late versus 8 days late. But I guess you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere.
Two measurements in our schedule reliability report. One is the schedule reliability itself, and then if the vessel is 1 day late or 5 days late, it will count as late. So you can say that's just counting as 1 point. The other measurement we have is how late is late. So you have there two measurements in there that says how many vessels are late, and of those vessels, how many days are then those vessels late. How many late vessels, or how many late arrivals, and of those late arrivals, how many days are they then late? And then you have that measurement to say, well, that carrier is, on average 7 days late or 5 days late, while that carrier is on average 2 days late. So even if as a shipper you don't really have a choice, you have to choose between bad carriers, you now have a choice between bad and worse carriers.
That's really helpful. And I think both of those measures, like in combination, can start to help shippers to understand, well, what's the reliability, so the consistency in order to leverage that data, for example, for planning purposes, but also what does the delta look like between the schedule and the actual realized schedule. So maybe, Niels, you can give some context on the historical evolution of reliability over the last couple of years, and maybe where it sits now compared to where it's been, maybe at just a macro level. If we talk about the main trades, so like Asia, Europe, Trans-Pacific, how has it really changed?
And if we start globally, because we have what we call the global measurement, which is very overall, but that's sort of the measurement that we have out there very quickly. Normal pre-pandemic levels of global reliability was somewhere between 70 to 90% amongst all carriers, basically. What we saw then by mid 2020 and going into 2021-22 was a significant drop, and so far down as the 2021 we saw down to 30% on a global level. The trend is actually very equal to what happens on the individual trade lanes, Trans-Pacific, Asia, Europe, Transatlantic, and so forth. It's only a matter of the level. We have seen Asia, Europe went down to below 20% at some time in 2021. Trans-Pacific, as you know, with all the vessels stuck up outside of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and later on also outside of the East Coast, the schedule reliability was horrific, and we went up at some point down to 10% due to all these congestions that we had. What we see since the last 4, 5, 6 months is that the schedule reliability is an upward going trend. We are not near the pre-pandemic levels, but we're getting there. We are looking at some 40, 50, going slightly above 55% now. So we're getting up to that level again. But and now we also see that it's very different from trade to trade. So it's not all trades. All trades are following the trend that it's upgoing, but not all trades are following that it's closing in on the pre-pandemic. So there's a different level of speediness with which we are seeing the recovery.
No, that's a really good kind of macro picture. And I think, one of the things that struck me as interesting was that obviously during the pandemic and more recently in response to both the challenges in the market, that were more external, but also as a result of, let's say, internal decisions within the shipping lines, there have been various periods with significant port omissions, with significant blank sailing programs taken on by the carriers, and often those port omissions and those blank sailing programs happen very close to the time of sailing. They happen a little bit at the last minute and have a dramatic impact on schedule reliability. One of the things that struck me as interesting was that sometimes it's a bit confusing in the schedule reliability numbers, because some carriers will adopt, when they need to reduce capacity or there are issues around, their ability to service the lanes, they'll adopt, let's say, a blanking program. So they'll take the entire service out, whilst others will omit ports, which might mean that there's still a service from nearby ports, but not available from the port that you might expect cargo to move from. Can you maybe just talk to that for a minute? Because I think that there can be, I guess, that kind of rationalization of services can have an impact on customer decisions as we move forward.
You have to bear in mind what I said earlier, that we had this 2-week lockdown period from the schedule to the actual arrival. So if the carriers have actually announced all their blank sailings and their capacity withdrawal or even service withdrawal prior to 2 weeks, then it will actually not impact the schedule reliability. It will impact the capacity that has been deployed in the trade. It will impact the blank sailing counter, which we're also tracking separately. But the schedule reliability will actually not be impacted if they have announced all of this in due time. The problem comes when they have these last minute cancellations and last minute capacity withdrawals. Then it will have a heavy impact on the schedule reliability. The vessel is not showing up, so it will have the impact of one late vessel on the schedule reliability part. But on the late vessel arrival measurement, it will have a significant impact, but now it's not showing up at all. Right? As long as they announce the capacity program or capacity withdrawal program in due time, it will not have a significant impact on the schedule reliability number. It will have an impact on the experience of the customer, of course, of the shipper. So that's why we have this separate blank sailing tracking program going on. And the blank sailing tracking, we can definitely see where the pandemic hit and when it didn't hit. There's a huge increase in blank sailings and capacity withdrawals in 2021, 22.
And I guess I think the point that you're making is really interesting because if shippers can understand the extent to which capacity has been removed ahead of time, then they can plan around that capacity reduction, and they can plan their supply chain appropriately. I think it's when these changes happen really at the last minute that it starts to impact their ability to manage their supply chain.
If a carrier can say that, okay, 4 weeks, 5 weeks up ahead, I will not have it's actually going back to pre-pandemic levels as well. In that period, if you have a dry dock maintenance that you need to do 5 weeks in advance, you plan your way around it. You say to the customer, I will not have a shipper. I will not have a shipment in that week. I will not have capacity in that week. Nothing is different than that, right? So even in the pandemic, you had these areas or these timings where the carriers are saying, well, you know what, guys, 6 weeks, 5 weeks, 4 weeks from now, I will cancel this sailing. You guys plan around it. We will have other sailings. We will have more capacity in this on this port or that terminal. As you say, correctly so, the problem comes on this last minute cancellation, this last minute capacity withdrawal, or we've even seen last minute service withdrawals. That the development in the trade is just so strong that the carriers impossibly for them to forecast it, and then you have the problem for the shipper that they can't plan their way out of it in their supply chain.
Well, I think the pandemic did two things from what I can say, and you can see this reflected in the reliability data. One, it highlighted the extent to which supply chains are very fragile when it comes to things outside of the shipping line's control. So, whether that's the impact on the pandemic and how it had, extreme impacts on demand and supply, or the extent to which the infrastructure meant that port congestion was really having an impact on schedule reliability. To things like the incident in the Suez Canal, which was really very much outside of anyone's control. It really impacted, I guess, the fragility of, let's say, the supply side of shipping lines and their schedules. But the other thing it highlighted was the extent to which, carriers really don't have a lot of visibility over demand, and how last minute changes in demand are quite difficult to adapt to as a shipping line, as a carrier. And that lack of visibility then has a knock-on effect to the customer because of the decisions that the carriers will make at the last minute. I maybe want to just roll that conversation forward and say, obviously now we're in an environment where reliability is a bit better, but we still have this fragility of demand, lack of understanding necessarily of changes in demand. We're potentially going into a restocking environment at one point later in the year, but we don't really know when, and that will have an impact on capacity. But we also have an environment where carriers are more used to actively managing capacity. So the extent to which they make changes in services is more frequent, and they're making those changes in services in the context of, let's say, a fragile carrier alliance setup. So maybe we'll come to the point on the alliances in a second, but maybe just you can talk to the extent to which you anticipate, let's say, more changes to schedules on a go-forward basis because carriers more actively manage capacity than maybe they have in the past.
That's actually a very interesting question, because you're absolutely right. That would be in a normal healthy environment. If the demand goes down, they should be withdrawing their capacity to match the demand in the market. We are seeing the quite opposite, and that's also a little bit of the explanation. Actually, a lot of the explanation behind the crazy drop in freight rates that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 months. So what we're seeing is we have a heavy lack of demand, if you want to call it. I don't know if you can call it a decrease, but the demand is not as big as people thought it would be by far. Normally, they would have to withdraw the capacity. They don't. When we've been talking to carriers and we say, "But why are you not withdrawing your capacity?" And like, "Oh, well, we're ready for price war." And like, that's stupid, right? But they seem to be more willing now to take a hit on the freight rates, uh, because I mean, let's not beat the bush about it, right? They have a lot of cash stocked around, and it seems like they're willing to spend some of that on keeping the capacity running rather than to withdraw it, which would have been the normal case. Actually, right now the carriers are not reacting the way that you would expect them to in a scenario where you have a low demand and a lot of capacity. We are having currently somewhere between 12 and 15% overcapacity on the major trades. And on top of that, you get in 2023, you have another 9% of new building capacity coming online. In 2024, there's another 9% of new building capacity coming on. So it's not like we're going to lack capacity in the coming month. It's going to be worse. So either the freight rails will take a drop even more than it has been already, or they will simply be forced to start taking out capacity. And by now, it would not even be enough to remove capacity the way that they did in pandemic. They literally have to close services and lay off vessels in order for them to match the demand.
Do you think that the foray of the carriers into end-to-end logistics means that it's actually positive for the shipper from a freight rate perspective? Because if a carrier needs to maintain a direct relationship with a shipper, they need to offer a weekly service because they want the end shipper to maintain kind of cargo moving on their service, and therefore they can't just think about their capacity as a blend of capacity across the market. They have to think about maintaining a direct relationship with the end customer, and that actually leads to overcapacity in the market.
Well, it's a difficult question because the carriers are taking very individual routes in terms of what is their strategy or what is do they really want to be end to end carrier? Not all of them, right? Maersk has taken one extreme end to end strategy. MSC less so. Hapag Lloyd even not. I mean, they literally went out and say we don't want to be end to end carrier. So it's a very different strategy that we're seeing in terms of the carriers that do have this end-to-end desire. I do believe that we will see them being ready to eat into their profit on the ocean going in order to keep the customers on the end-to-end trails. There is more money on land-based transport than there is on ocean-based transport. That's for sure. There's also a lot more work and trouble with it, and a lot more risk associated with it. So no wonder. But if Maersk, as an example, if Maersk wants to take the end to end, to take the pre-carriage and the on-carriage part of it, well, maybe they need to offer a lower rate on the ocean part of it. That's going to hurt a carrier like Harper, who does not want to have the pre-carriage and on-carriage part of it. So yeah, they have different strategies. Will it be easier for a shipper? I don't know. Some shippers will enjoy it for sure. Some shippers will not enjoy to have the end-to-end, and I think we're also going to see a bit of an uproar from some of the bigger forwarders, from whom these carriers are literally taking business away, right?
No, it just strikes me as interesting that the change in and maybe we can talk to, we were going to discuss, a little earlier, we can talk to the change in the landscape of the alliances, but the change in the landscape of the alliances can have an impact on overall reliability because if each of the carriers are maintaining their own services, there might be more of an onus on having regular weekly services. And therefore, maybe it favors, let's say, the reliability of niche and specific services, but could be to the detriment of overall capacity. I don't know how you think about that.
My personal conviction is that we will not see too many individual carriers around. We will see a reshuffle of the alliance networks, and we will see carriers partnering up with other carriers than they are today. Yes, there will be. MSC has already been out saying we want to do it alone. I'm sure they will try to do it alone. Maybe they will be successful, maybe they will not. That being said, I'm also sure that on some of their services, they will be more than willing to sell space to other carriers just to fill up their slots, etc. So what is an alliance? What maybe the future will be a more fractured alliance, if you can call it like that. It will be, not officially alliance, but Hapag will buy space on MSC, MSC will buy space on CMA, CMA will buy on Maersk, and Maersk on Hapag. I don't know. That's one solution that is out there, that you don't have an alliance on paper, but you just have a lot of small slot charters, or maybe even on vessel sharing agreements like we used to have. There will be cooperations. I don't believe any carrier as such can stand alone. Another solution would then be that the carriers that have the same interest, say Maersk, CMA, who both have interest in having an end-to-end, should they be in the same corporation, or should they be in two different corporations? They could probably talk better together if they were together, right? Because they have the same interest at hand, but on the other hand, they have the same interest at hand, right? So will they be competing for the same customer, etc.? So that's something that carriers will have to think about when they enter into a new, let's call it a new alliance scenario. I don't think we will have something called alliances. We will have vessel corporations.
Well, I think your point on cooperation and I guess the fluidity of space on shipping lines is very interesting. And I would say maybe one of the things that's been a historical barrier to let more fluidity in alliances is technology to some extent, because, if you need to be able to book space on each other's ships at the last minute, or to understand a live picture of capacity, that's historically been more of a challenge. And so, larger, more blocked out agreements between carriers have been the norm. As the technology becomes available, to be more fluid in the way in which bookings and capacity is managed, but also as the technology improves when it comes to understanding the demand side of the picture and where there might be shortfalls in space, I can definitely see the relationships between the carriers and the ability to sell space on each other's vessels becoming more fluid. And I think that will be positive for the market in general.
I think so too. And as you say, with the technology coming available, I would not be surprised. Currently, we are having a number of niche carriers around the world that is what we call third-party carriers. Basically, they don't have customers themselves. They sell all their space to various other carriers, global carriers, for instance, right? But they're on a niche area. They're on regional levels. I would not be surprised if we saw one or two of them develop into a global third-party carrier with no particular shipper or customer themselves, but simply offering the space on certain trade lanes to the global carriers or the carriers who have customers. If I'm carrier A, I want to work with carrier B on this trade, and carrier C on that trade, and carrier D on a third trade. This is the freedom I get without being in an alliance, but rather to be in vessel corporations or vessel sharing agreements, or whatever we tend to call them. And I can definitely see some of these third-party carriers coming in there, offering space, and thus not being actually in competition to the global carriers' customers, but simply offering a space like a bus.
Well, let's watch this space as things unfold. And Niels, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I think what's clear is that schedule reliability is ever evolving, that we're lucky to say that 2023 is a better year for schedule reliability, and it's one where there will continue to be a lot of fluidity in the market, and one where we will certainly learn from what's coming out of the carriers as it relates to the alliances and what the future picture is going to look like for the shape of the ocean routes and trades. So I look forward to the chance of having you back on in a few months' time and seeing how things have evolved. I'd like to say thank you very, very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, and I will look forward to being here in a couple of months later to see if I was a dork in my predictions, or whether I was right. Let's see.
And thank you everyone else for being on another episode of Freight to the Point. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our series on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts if you enjoyed this session. And if you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. We'd absolutely love to hear from you.